Okay, volume 5 of this video experiment. I'm hoping this doesn't just turn into another rant, because at this point, even though I stand by my rants at this point, I think they're conceptually necessary for me at least to flesh out what I'm talking about, and that will be relevant to the actual concrete mathematics. However, I want to get to some concrete mathematics, even if I can't explain it fully or even like begin to at this point. I'm going to try to at least bring it up, bring some stuff up. You got to have some math. That's just like straightforward math. But before I do that, last video I mentioned Dante's Inferno and got cut off. My whole point was that for obvious dramatic narrative reasons, because you have to build to a climax usually if you're telling a story. Um, yeah, like Dante's Inferno begins with the least painful circle of hell and then goes and builds from there into the most painful. Um, in my philosophy, in radical depressive realism, it's the exact opposite. Not geometrically in the sense that I'm not adopting like two-dimensional concentric circles as the underlying geometric concept. In other words, like the geometric concepts that I'm going to be using are going to get way more complicated than that, but it's the same. It's in the realm of what Dante is talking about. It's a work of poetry, obviously, in Dante's case. It's not like a rigorous philosophical or mathematical argument, but the idea for me is that, yeah, you begin with the worst forms. Like you just jump to the worst things imaginable, and then, like the worst things imaginable that are real, that are actually happening, or that are actually where there's actually a high probability of them happening, not just like things that are hypothetically horrifying but aren't realistic. You start with that, and the goal is, of course, to work your way to what? Well, you work your way to the least painful form of hell. In other words, let go of the idea that there's any way out of hell. You're in hell. There is no purgatory. There is no paradise. This is it. So you have to make the best of it, literally, which means you might as well not be in the worst circle of hell, as it were, even though I'm going to be using different geometric concepts than that. But that was the idea. In other words, like if I was in um, Dante's position in the story of the Inferno, and Virgil was leading me through the gates, saying, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." I would be like looking up at the gates and being like, "Yeah, fuck, am I, right?" Like, in other words, like I would understand, like, yeah, I've abandoned my hope like a long time ago, but thanks for the heads up. And then Virgil would lead me in, and it would be the least painful form of hell, and we would see like, well, this fucking sucks, right? And then I would turn to Virgil and be like, "Does it get better from here?" And he'd be like, "No, no, 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 it gets worse." And I'm like, "Okay, so then we should just stay here then." And Virgil would be like, "No, we gotta keep going." I'd be like, "No, you don't." And then I would be arguing radical depressive realism. Like that would be my argument to Virgil. Is like, you can go ahead if you're like stupid enough to do that, I guess. Like I'll stay here if this is like if it's getting worse. But obviously Virgil's like, no, 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 it'll get better. There's a purgatory, and then there's a paradise. We're gonna go to paradise, and you're gonna meet Beatrice. It's gonna be a whole thing. It's gonna be beautiful. And I'm like, yeah, I don't believe you though. I don't believe in those things. So I'll be here, and yeah, if you want to go do that until you realize what I'm saying, then I'll meet up with you again. But like, so that would not be a very interesting poem. Is my point. But philosophically, I'm convinced, and mathematically, that would be true. Like there's all kinds of mathematics that is not interesting to people who aren't interested in mathematics. I mean, like the whole of mathematics. One of my close friends, she's incredibly smart. I truly believe she's far more intelligent than me and that I'll ever be, really. And she has zero interest in mathematics. Like she has some basic, obvious mathematical comprehension, but she's like, if I bring up like the fundamental theorem of calculus to her, she's like, "Yeah, Ben, we've been over this. Like, I don't want to hear it." So like, I'm just not interested in it. I'm never going to be interested in it, and it's cool that you're interested. That's fine, but like, just don't bother bringing it up to me. And I'm like, but, where are we starting here? Anyway, like, she's totally. I have zero problem with that, basically. But yeah, this can get boring. Basically, I get it. Is my point. Yeah, quickly. I don't know how I've avoided mentioning Elizabeth Kubler-Ross this far into this video series, but uh, she is philosophically speaking like my mother or my grandmother, if you will. Like, I truly believe she is the greatest philosopher ever, meaning of those that I've been able to read, right? Like, meaning like books written in English, essentially, that were like actually written originally in English. Like, even ones that are translated into English, I'm not confident in, making any hierarchical assessment of really. I read those translations, of course, but there are all kinds of philosophical traditions that I have like no real awareness of. I can make predictions about what they're probably talking about, but like Chinese, like the history of Chinese philosophy and the language or the languages that are involved in writing it or communicating it. I have basically like no like yeah, I've studied Buddhism of course, so like I have some awareness, but like yeah. I have no awareness. Like Africa, philosophical traditions in Africa, especially in the indigenous tribes of Africa. It's like I could spend my whole life trying to just learn about that, of course. Same deal with like any indigenous tribe anywhere, like the Aborigines in Australia. What I've heard sounds really interesting, but I could spend my whole life studying that. Same thing with like the the Maya, like Mayan philosophy is extremely interesting. And I live in Michigan, so I tend to think in terms when I think of indigenous tribes, I think of the tribes that were here, like the influence that they had, despite being the victims of a genocidal process, of course, that removed them for the most part from this, or restricted them to this place called Walpole Island, which is a tiny, inspiring fragment of land that has never been ceded to European colonialists or colonialism, ceded in the sense of like forfeited. Like it's always been indigenous land, and Europeans just never bothered to take it away. And Walpole Island is the white person word or the name of the island. I can't think of what the presumably Algonquin name is because all the signs say Walpole Island, like Walpole Island over there. Anyway, I could spend there's so many like tribal philosophical traditions that are extremely interesting and may well have more direct relevance to what I'm saying than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But as far as I'm aware, I've read a lot of books. Those books are generally part of the European and American philosophical tradition in general. And of those books, this is the book that just cuts the bullshit and gets right to the point, basically. And like, if I had to recommend one book to somebody based on what I've read, it would be this book. Also, she is the real inventor or the discoverer, the theorist of what would now be called terror management theory. I could go on and on about this. It's crucially important to my philosophical views. I view my philosophy as an extension of terror management theory. But terror management theory is like basically formulated by this guy Sheldon Solomon and his two other colleagues who never show up in like public representation of the theory. Like it's always Sheldon Solomon, and he appears to be like the greatest living psychologist. So I have no problem with that. And when you read their book, "The Worm at the Core," which is the theoretical presentation of these ideas, it really sounds like Sheldon Solomon speaking. Like it sounds like he's the one writing it. And I assume that the other two guys are crucially important in the experimental process. That they're more like the scientists who are formulating the experiments that they did to gather the evidence for their theory. That's just my assumption. But all that matters is they have a gigantic pile of replicated evidence that it's proven. Like there's no competing theory. Right? In science, if you have one theory that has all of the evidence and that evidence is replicated, meaning it's trustworthy, and there's no one is even close to competing with you, we would tend to call that true. Like that would be a big deal. So we have the equivalent of like general relativity of the mind, and these they're not winning a Nobel Prize. They're not in the mental health system. I've yet to meet a single person who's even heard of this. Right? It's like being a physicist, and you're talking to people who are like trust me, bro, I know my shit. And you're like, oh, have you heard of general relativity? You know, Einstein? And they're like, never heard of it. Like, yeah, so you don't know your shit. I mean, that's just how this is. Like, you're not even close to knowing anything about your shit. Um, but yeah, she's the OG. She's a badass motherfucker. She's also in the lineage of Florence Nightingale, the nurse who invented scientific nursing, like the theory of nursing, like the kind of nursing that actually is nursing, right? Like you'd think that that's always existed, right? Like there are these shamanic traditions of medicine that go way back, and surely women were involved in this, and surely they were like, again, like the gendering of the nurse versus doctor thing is a whole history unto itself. But it's just like, surely there were like there was a distribution of responsibility in a medical sense, right? It wasn't just like the witch doctor or the shaman who took care of everything. Like he had assistants, or she had assistants, presumably, and those assistants were effectively nurses, right? And it's like, yeah, to an extent. However, you get to Florence Nightingale's time, and she's like, hey, there's no theory of nursing. Like these nurses are just people who they care, that's cool, but they're just cleaning bedpans and they bring the patient food and change the bed sheets and like tell them to believe in Jesus. Like that's basically. She's like, why is that all they're doing? Like, surely medical science is relevant to this discipline, right? And everyone's like, huh? And she's like, okay, I guess it falls on me to invent nursing. Jesus, fuck, like, what's wrong with you people? And then her family is like, Florence, no, you have to be a wife and a mother. You have to conform to these clearly irrational social standards. And she's like, fuck off. No, I'm going to be a nurse because that's important. I'm going to help people like not suffer and die in the worst possible way and use rational thinking to like interface with that notion. And yeah, she's a badass motherfucker basically, and she did that. And then Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is basically like the philosophical. She's standing on the shoulders of giants, if you will. Like she inherited that legacy basically, as I see it. Anyway, I could do a whole thing on just this, so we got to get to some math, for God's sake. Where to start? Let's clear up some stuff. We talked about this. This is a hyperbola conic section. It's a pretty cool idea unto itself. But it comes from this area equation that we dealt with these rectangles. Very simple idea, of course. This is a line. The problem with this is the zero rule, of course, right? Eventually you get to 0 divided by 0. And in high school math, they just tell you, like, don't do that. It's like a stop sign. And they never talk about it. But it's an indeterminate form, and I was saying at the end of that one video that what that means is not that this doesn't exist. Rather, this can be understood to be equivalent to literally anything. It's indeterminate. And for that reason, it's avoided because it's not, humanly speaking, meaningful, right? Like there's not much meaningful information you can derive from something that's equivalent to everything. That's important, though, because like I said that the area of this process remains 1 the whole time, including when it's 0 divided by 0. And it's like, whoa, how does that work? Because you're saying this, 0 divided by 0 is equivalent to anything. You're saying. I'm like, yeah, well, 1 is one example of anything. So it is equivalent to that at that level. It's just also equivalent to anything else. Which means what? Like, what am I describing here? Well, it's what in physics would be referred to as a singularity. So we've talked about paradox. We've talked about cognitive bias. And now we have to, like, put the other spin on that same idea, which is singularity. Like, what is a singularity? Well, it basically is just, like, empirically observable paradoxes that are actual, like, phenomena. Like, we can refer to them as objects in space. For example, a black hole is the most perhaps famous singularity, and the Big Bang, equally famous, right? But kind of the same thing, which is what leads physicists to suspect, and I suspect as well once they explain this to me, that we could be living in a black hole, literally. Like the Big Bang could be what is happening when everything is compressed infinitely into a black hole singularity, and then the Big Bang is what happens on the other side, as it were, which is invisible to us as far as observing black holes in the universe. Like we can't see a Big Bang on the other end, but that could be happening. There's no present reason anyway to think that that can't be happening, and there's many reasons to think that that's a plausible theory. So yeah, a Big Bang is a singularity, a black hole is a singularity, and then there's this other thing called a naked singularity in physics, which is essentially a black hole without an event horizon. In other words, there's no big circular. We think of a black hole, and it looks like a circular horizon where there's time dilation and space dilation around the perimeter, or around the circumference, I guess. And there's a given radius. There's an observable, measurable radius to some extent of a just black circle in space, and then it and there's a central singularity at the very center of this. But a naked singularity is just the center, essentially. It's a point. And when Euclid is saying, like, okay, to do geometry, we need to get some basics up and going. We need a point. What is a point? It's a dimensionless thing. And everyone's like, well, what does that mean? It's like, look, you just have to. It's a singularity, is what it is. Like, it's paradoxical. It's inherently irresolvable as an idea, but you need it axiomatically to do anything. So just singularity, we need it, and then we need a line. So we need a one-dimensional extension from any given point, which has no width. It's only pure length. And the philosophically minded student is like, well, what does that mean though? Like, how can you have no width? It should be invisible. And Euclid's like, yeah, right, but this is another kind of singularity, essentially. Like, it's a singularity with regards to width, but we're going to say some stuff about the length, and we can do geometry with it. And then you're like, okay. And we never come back to that idea, and that ends up being a problem throughout all of mathematics, because those are problems of infinity, right? Like, the role of infinity in mathematics is continuously troublesome to human minds. Finity is continuously attractive to human minds, and the ultimate reality is the irresolvability of both infinity and finitude at the same time. In other words, you can't have your cake and eat it too, sort of thing, with regards, meaning like you need both of these concepts. You can't escape either one of them ever. Like, even death is essentially both. Right? And we can get more into that. God, I'm running out of time already. I'm trying to force myself to be more succinct. But yeah, so like x over x. Basic, right? It's a line. And we think, like, we understand this shit, certainly. Like, this is just a straightforward line. Right? Well, but remember what I just said about Euclid, and what I just said about the zero rule. So, like, that intersection point, there's no point in zooming in, because there's no way, firstly, for my calculator to represent this, and also for us to perceive a singularity. But at that intersection point is literally a singularity. Like, mathematically speaking, if you were, this is a bit of an analogy. You'd have to, like, mathematically define what this is. But imagine you're like an ant, or just a person, I guess, walking along this line. So you're like walking in this direction, and you're moving towards this, and you're perceiving a continuity of a horizon in front of you, like, no problem, basically. This is a sidewalk. I can walk straight. Unfortunately, when you get to this point, you fall into a singularity, literally. Like, you can't get over this if you're moving in some kind of hypothetical continuous sense. And that should be mind-blowing, basically. Like, if it isn't, you're not perceiving it for what it is. It's like, right here, my calculator is, like, mathematically speaking, an act like a black hole, literally. Like, obviously, in physical terms, there's no black hole in here, but, like, in mathematical terms, that's what is happening, and it's completely invisible. Right? Like, that should be pretty far out. And yeah, we could just go on and on about this. Quick stuff. Rationality is the set of navigational principles used in the hunt for Eureka, or Amazing Grace. I was blind and now I see. Meaning how to step aside from any given cognitive bias. Right? Like, that's what rationality is. Unfortunately, we're always stuck within the context of cognitive bias, and we can't ever complete this process. It's always, which is important, it's only ever incomplete. And we know from Gödel's incompleteness and completeness theorems that that's a real, like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want consistency, and we should in mathematics, of course, in reasoning, certainly in physics, if you want consistency and you want formal power, like a scope and power and the arbitrary richness of explanatory, you know, ability essentially, and which, yeah, we're like, yeah, sign me up. That's what we want. That's what you want. You want to be consistent. You want a consistent formal system. Well, you're going to have to accept that it's incomplete, because if you could prove the axiom and the axioms by which you formulate the system within the system, it would be inconsistent, and then it breaks. So, like, if you want a complete system, you have to accept inconsistency, which means contradictoriness, which means your shit's not going to make sense at some level. So, you know, unfortunately, for all the Christian apologist theologians out there, and that, people who think similarly to them, this is not only, like, people have tried to argue that Gödel's incompleteness and completeness theorems are arguments for the existence of God, and therefore, like, justification for, like, Christian theology. And it's like, no. In fact, like, this is the refutation of exactly that way of thinking. Like, you can't have both, right? Like, the Christian wants to have both. You want both completeness and consistency, and it won't work. Like, and that's why Christianity is ultimately full of shit, and we all know it. But moving on. Okay, math. Jesus. Paradox, though. I just want to quickly say that in my philosophical system, so paradoxes, they're not, there's no such thing as paradoxes, ultimately. It's the concept of paradox, so it's analogous to, like, the concept of matter. We don't have matters in physics, right? Like, we have matters in the news or whatever, but, like, there's no matters. There's no, like, other kind of matter. I mean, you have antimatter and so forth, but, like, what I mean is, like, Jupiter, Earth, the sun, a galaxy, a nebula, a shooting star, a meteor, whatever. Like, these are all matter. These are examples of matter. These are formally distinct, but they're ultimately composed at some level of the same stuff. That's what paradox is. There's no other kind of paradox. And I think it's unfortunate that if you read a long list of paradoxes, it implies that there are many kinds of paradoxes. And that's not true. Like, these are just examples, like manifestations of the same thing. So given that, in my philosophical system, I could just waste time coming up with an infinite number of paradoxes, and I don't want to do that. So I'm trying to settle on, like, some arbitrary number, because I need to contribute my, these are unique to me as far as I know, in terms of, like, how I'm expressing them and the context of the paradox. But I don't want to just come up with a million of these things. So I was trying to do 3. I have 4. I have to settle on something. But, like, the Refeeding Syndrome paradox. Okay, in medical science, there's this thing, starvation, right? And the solution to starvation is food, you would think. However, you get to a severe enough form of starvation, and the rules change, paradoxically, meaning food can kill you. And people are like, what? And it's like, yeah. So you have to think more rigorously, more scientifically, if you want to not kill someone who's severely starved. Also, this is the really depressing part, i.e. radical depressive realism. This is, like, the truth that is inherently depressing, which is that a severe enough form of starvation, which includes, like, a child, a severe enough form of starvation cannot be cured. There is such thing as incurable starvation, meaning any amount of food will kill this person. And the starvation will kill them. So just enjoy your time together, because there's nothing you can do. And that's sad. So the problem is, starvation is just one example of this exact same phenomenon. And the phenomenon that will be most relevant to me, both personally, like in my own life, and in my philosophical system here, is how this applies to severe depression. So severe depression is, biochemically speaking, one, a severe chronic pain disorder, which the mental health system still doesn't understand to this day. And I don't want to go off the rails on that, but it is a form of starvation. It's a dopamine starvation, at the very least. It's a starvation of many things, ultimately, and it can involve actual, like, nutritional starvation as well. But yeah, it's this. I've dealt with this in therapy my whole life. It's like I come in, and the therapist has only ever dealt with people well, they've only ever been taught to deal with people with effectively mild forms of depression, which matter. Like, that's pain too. But you can feed that person with things like a positive outlook or a growth mindset or doing daily affirmations or just eating healthy and exercising or, you know, spending time with a puppy or going out on a nice day and looking at, all these things that therapists tell you to do. And that will help that person most likely, right? Just like feeding someone who hasn't eaten for a week will help them medically. But yeah, if the person that comes in is me, I've been, I'm 37 now. I'm an old man. I've been depressed since I was 10. So like, you could literally kill me with that shit. Meaning like, you're just driving me closer to suicide and you don't even know it. Literally. And I've tried to explain this many times. And these people, meaning therapists, have a hard time understanding this because it's inherently paradoxical. And what I've learned is that if I bring up refeeding syndrome, they start to kind of get it. So this is really important in my philosophical system. All right, let me just rattle off some other paradoxes. This is going to be important, but it's not. Ready? This might be important. What else? Blue collar refeeding syndrome with regards to blue collar depression, like specifically in a socioeconomic sense, is important in especially in American politics because, like, how is Donald Trump, who like obviously has no real understanding of blue collar life, how is he so beloved by so many blue collar workers in America? Like, that's a big part of his support base. And the Democrats, like the stereotypical Democrat, like Joe fucking Biden, fuck that guy. I have, yeah. Anyway, fuck him, fuck Trump, fuck every politician basically. Like Justin Trudeau is a complete fucking moron, obviously. Um, yeah, but like how the Democrats don't understand, like how are these people, these blue collar workers who are struggling to make ends meet, why would they vote for Donald Trump when they know that we're trying to distribute resources and get wages up and blah blah blah? It's like, well, it has to do with the fact that you're constantly talking down to them, you're condescending to them as if they're idiots, and they're not because it's hard to do skilled trades. Basically, it's also hard though to like be socially conscious while you spend like 13 hours a day every day of your life for like 50, 60 years or something crazy doing a skilled trade. You're not going to have like literacy in economics, really. You're not going to be able to develop literacy in so-called political science, which fuck that shit. There's no such, like, that's not a science. There's actually no such thing as political science, really. There could be in theory, but like, it's not existent. And anyway, so when you insult people like this over like generation after generation, they kind of get the hint. Blue collar people are way smarter than culture acknowledges, and than our culture acknowledges, including like physicists. Like a physicist who's seen some shit in real life will understand. Like, wow, skilled tradesmen are like, and tradeswomen and trades, however you want to gender yourself, people are quite gifted, mostly for the most part, like a very skilled electrician, plumber, etc. But yeah, it's this phrase, backbone of the country. The working class is the backbone of this country. And people saying that think they're giving a compliment. Why? Because they're caught in a cognitive bias. They're caught in a paradox. They're caught in refeeding syndrome. They don't realize how depressed, how starved for encouragement and affirmation, acknowledgement of their intelligence, the blue-collar world is. So when you say backbone of the country, I guarantee that any blue-collar worker who knows anything is watching their TV and they're saying something like, "Oh, I'm the fucking backbone. So what does it make you? The brain? You're the brain of this country, and I'm the backbone. Great. And what homeless people are the sphincter of this country, I guess. And the large intestine, that's like, the lower middle class the disabled, who aren't homeless but can't participate in blue collar jobs." Like, that's what you're saying. So like, they're the lower intestine or whatever, and the homeless people are the sphincter, and I'm the backbone, and you're the fucking brain. Fuck you, right? And they have every reason to say that. I say that all the time. Whenever I hear someone say this shit, backbone of the country, it's like, fuck you. Anyway, very important, obviously, to like what's going on in our country. this looks like a crazy person wrote it. This was last night. It was written by a crazy person, and that person is me. And until I understand it, it's gonna look crazy. But some other paradoxes, real quick. Anyone with Down syndrome is cooler than Miles Davis paradox. This sounds like a joke. It's not a joke. Like, I really mean people with Down syndrome are actually, when you look at it, like, better people. They're cooler than Miles Davis. Another one. This is important. Sisyphus is happy is the same as saying everyone but me is on crack except it's heaven paradox. Like, again, we could get into that. I'm running out of time, so there's like no point. I thought I had written out some more. Oh, same kind of deal. The zombie is smarter than John von Neumann paradox. This is going to be a takedown of the illusoriness of absolutist notions of intelligence, basically. So when I say zombie, I basically mean like in the Haitian like voodoo context of like a scopolamine victim or something. Scopolamine is a drug that puts someone into a zombified state, if you will. And there is a way to argue mathematically that that person is actually smarter, quote unquote, than John von Neumann, who's often assumed to be the smartest person ever. And yeah, and what is the other thing? It's like, I'm realizing that I was talking about Schopenhauer going for the jugular with